Hi, welcome, Energy and Sustainability Community of Interest. Thanks for joining us again for another informative and interesting webinar. We had a great turnout last month, really great turnout last month. I think 176 people on the initial webinar for electric vehicle planning. And I'm really excited that we're able to bring in as much interest into this second deeper dive into EV planning for DoD bases. I think there was something like 120 registered as of yesterday. So hopefully we hit a similar number and get the word out today as well. Today, we're going to be exploring the impacts of wide-scale electrification on installations and the complex elements that play into making progress on the ambitious goal around EVs with Executive Order 14057. My short bio, if you've joined any of these in the past, you should recognize my face now. My name is Matt McCann. I'm a retired Navy Civil Engineer Corps officer. I had a heavy focus on facilities management and energy efficiency management during my Navy career. I joined AECOM about 7 years ago when I retired, and I'm our federal energy market sector lead. Let's see. First, let's get some of the administrative and housekeeping stuff out of the way. If you're trying to connect through VPN, you're probably having issues. So if you can see any of it, disconnect the VPN and try again. Similarly, if you're having trouble connecting audio, you may not hear what I'm saying, but hopefully you can see the troubleshooting here and connect the audio correctly. As far as we operate the webinar, you can use the chat screen, the chat tab, to post anything if you have technical issues or if you want to share anything else generally. Please feel free to post your name and where you're calling in from. That's something that's it's always fun to see who's joining. If you have questions though for the presenter, please post them in the Q&A tab. That way we can kind of keep track of it. You can upvote them to make sure I get to it if it's a question that's really popular. And as usual, we started the recording right at the top of the hour, so you'll be able to get to all of this if you want to see it later or refer any of your friends or colleagues to it. Just a short update on the community of interest. As always, if you're interested in serving on the steering committee, send a note to Norm Campbell. Even if you don't know how you want to help, if you just want to reach out to Norm, we can help you find some way to help. Upcoming events, we're going to round out the third and kind of what we've established as a mini electric vehicle series here, probably in September. The date's not locked in yet. We're going to have a briefing from folks who work with the state of Colorado and their collaboration with NREL to develop EV site selection tools. I think that'll be an interesting kind of round out to this conversation and the previous one. Then for the rest of the year, we'll continue with some of the decarbonization and carbon capture topics to round out the year. Other upcoming events and conferences, that AEE, Association of Energy Engineers World Conference, is coming up in Atlanta in September and 21st and 23rd. I want to put in a big plug for Energy Exchange in Cincinnati in October. No, it's not an SAME event as AEE, but it will be heavily attended by DoD energy professionals, virtually all the other federal agencies, ESCOs, utilities, and others in the energy space. Energy Exchange, as always, will have a robust technical program with sessions on federal government leadership in the energy space, decarbonization, electrification, climate change, resilience, energy technology, performance contracting, funding, financing, and many others. Really good technical program for that conference. And of course, the SAME Small Business Conference is coming up in November in Nashville. There are slides on both Energy Exchange and SBC, promotional slides at the end of the slide deck here, so you can see them. And then one more administrative item. We like to do a poll at the beginning of our webinars to get an idea of who's on today. So Carl's going to pull that up, and if you could just take a second to submit. I know the poll will be open for a while, so we can capture everybody who joins. Next, on to the main event. I feel lucky today to have John Hallowell from the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI. He's a senior technical executive and team member in EPRI's electric transport group, where he focuses on smart charging, infrastructure development for plug-in electric vehicles. He's been with EPRI since 2007. He's been active in electric transportation since 2008. And he's the current chair of the SAE Electric Vehicle Conductive Charge Coupler Task Force and co-chair of the SAE Aircraft Energy Storage and Charging Committees. He's a member of IEEE. He holds an extra class amateur radio license, and he also enjoys hiking, playing guitar, and building and repairing guitar tube amps. So please take it away, John.
Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate the introduction. We're going to dive in here. Today I want to talk about the challenges and approaches to electrifying a military base, particularly the vehicles and equipment on that base. The outline of my talk is on the screen here. First, we're going to talk a little bit about power, time, and energy. It's really a critical aspect to understand if you think about the transition from liquid fuel to electricity. There's some big differences in how you deliver energy. So we'll spend a bit of time on that. And then the bottom two blocks are sort of the balance of how you do this, right? On one side, you have the vehicles. They have population, locations, and energy and power needs. And then on the right side would be the electricity grid on the base, which has a capacity and has to balance out. You can't have more vehicles needing energy that can't be delivered by the grid. So that's a really critical balance, and we'll spend some time talking about that. The first thing we think about liquid fueling compared to an electric vehicle or an electric backhoe, electric forklift. One difference is that over the years we've been blessed. Like we have liquid fuels, diesel, JP8, whatever, jet fuels, gasoline. They have very high energy content for a given weight. So a gallon of gasoline carries about 34 kilowatt hours of energy. To give you an example, I have a Nissan Leaf that has a 30 kilowatt hour battery that will take that car roughly 100 miles. So it actually contains less energy in the battery than a single gallon of gas to operate that vehicle. It's about 100-to-1 ratio right now. So if you look at lithium batteries, a 34 kilowatt hour lithium battery would probably fall in the range of around 600 pounds. That is gradually improving, generally a few percent every year. But it is one of the key limitations about replacing liquid fuel. We've had, maybe we're spoiled a bit in that liquid fuels carry a lot of energy in a very compact space and a fairly low amount of weight. Probably the next key difference about the fueling between liquid fueling and electricity is that, generally with gasoline or diesel or jet fuel, you're going to have a repository of that fuel. You're going to have a location where you store that. It's probably safer and just more convenient logistically to have one location. So you take the vehicles to that location to fuel, and that's pretty common. The bases that I've seen have some location where they're taking their vehicles and fueling those. Oftentimes you may have tanks where you can move fuel around. You might have diesel or jet fuel or gasoline that is in containers that you move to use on site. For example, using a backhoe at a construction site, it may be fueled on site, but generally that fuel came from a central location. With electricity, wherever electricity is available, with capacity where you can put in a charge station or access to that electricity, you can fuel there. So it's a little bit different paradigm. I kind of think of this in the Old West. You fueled your horse when you got to your location. You parked your horse and it ate. That's kind of like an electric vehicle. We're used to fueling very quickly with liquid fuels. It's a longer operation when you fuel with electricity. I think part of that is that last bullet on the lower left there. You can deliver a lot of fuel quickly, a liquid fuel. You can put 20 gallons of fuel into a vehicle in just a few minutes. And so you're putting a very large amount of energy very quickly. For electricity, time matters. And we'll spend some time here talking about how that kind of comes into play when you talk about transferring electrons as opposed to a liquid fuel. So when we talk about electric power, usually utilities speak of in the unit of kilowatts. So power in kilowatts, it is a representation of how fast work is done. that would be equivalent in a vehicle to say horsepower. Horsepower and kilowatts power would be different units of the same thing. When you're thinking about equipment in operation, it's the rate that you're doing the work. When you think about charging that equipment or replenishing that energy in the equipment, then it's very similar to what we would call grid capacity. So how much power can the electric grid deliver? Energy is a measure of how much work you've done. It's measured in kilowatt hours. So it's actually the product of time and power. So the graph there at the bottom, the vertical axis is power. I've kind of highlighted the area under that curve. That area is equal to the energy, and it is the product of power versus time. So if it was a nice rectangle, if you have a kilowatt per 1 hour, that's 1 kilowatt hour. Pretty straightforward. The thing is, we can manipulate that. We have the ability to operate at different power levels and extend time. So the amount of energy you deliver is a function of both the power you have and how much time you have to deliver that. When you think about equipment charging, energy is related more to, say, if it's a vehicle, probably how far it's driven. If it's a piece of equipment, how long has it been running or how much work has it done? So again, energy being measure of work, power being how quickly we do that work. So this is an example, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also really true. The calories in a jelly donut and the energy in a hand grenade and running a 1 kilowatt hair dryer for about 15 minutes, those all are about the same amount of energy, about 1/4 of a kilowatt hour. So this is emphasizing that relationship of time and power. Again, it's power is the product, or energy is the product of time and power. So when we think about a jelly donut, you eat that, your body can produce heat from that and energy from that for hours. So it's an energy spread over a long period of time. A hand grenade takes that same amount of energy and concentrates it into milliseconds. So, thousandths of a second that energy is released. And you can see the radical difference between a jelly donut giving you calories for a few hours and a hand grenade doing damage very quickly. And then just for reference, if you have a 1 kilowatt hair dryer, which is kind of typical of hair dryers, usually around 1,000 watts, if you run that for 15 minutes, that's a kilowatt hour. So if I go back real quick, if you think about my example here, you could think of running a hair dryer for 34 hours. That's kind of what these batteries could do on the electric side. So why does that matter? Well, one of the key things about electricity is the higher the power level that you deliver it at, the more it's going to cost you. It is always lowest cost with electricity to deliver that at the lowest power level possible. So if I was a good artist, my little sketch here on the left, the area under these 3 curves would be equal. So the bottom curve, think of the jelly donut, that's slow charging. Usually in the EV space, we would refer that to level 1 charging, where you use 120 volt outlet. And that's generally up maybe to a couple kilowatts in the charging space. And you need to do that for many hours. If you're talking about an electric vehicle charging at 2 kilowatts, you're adding maybe 2 or 3 miles of range to that vehicle every hour. So it's very slow. The middle curve, you can think of that as kind of modest power charging. So that might be like level 2 charging, using 208 volts or 240 volts to charge vehicles. EVs are running in like 7 to 10 kilowatt range. It's possible to go all the way up to 20 kilowatts using AC power. Again, now we've shortened the time. So by going to higher power, we need less time to charge that vehicle. Typical for an electric vehicle, charging at 7 kilowatts, that adds about 25 miles for every hour you're plugged in. So almost a factor of 10 above what we would call the low and slow. So here's the jelly donut. That's kind of the middle. And then think of the hand grenade. Not saying that DC charging is like a hand grenade, but it does have very high power concentrated in a short period of time to deliver the energy. So this can be anywhere from 10 to 20 kilowatts for modest sized DC fast charging, all the way up to 350 kilowatts by the standards for light duty vehicles. So 350,000 watts, that's now you're at the level of delivering miles per minute while you're plugged in. So again, more than an order of magnitude faster than the previous example. All of these are viable for vehicles, and generally, the cost, like the bottom one is the lowest cost, the equipment is the lowest cost, the cost of the electricity will be lowest, and you have kind of mid and high. But there may be places where you need to turn around a piece of equipment so quickly that you need that higher power in order to meet the vehicle's needs. To give an example there, if you had a pickup truck and say it's operating on a flight line and it's used a couple hours a day running errands on a base, that vehicle sits idle 22 hours. So more than likely, given the size of a typical base, you probably could run that truck using level 1 charging, that lowest, slowest form of charging, just by making sure it's plugged in when it's idle. Now, the catch there is you can't plug it in if there's not a charger. So you need to have charging available at the locations where that truck might remain idle. So while you may have a place where all the vehicles are parked at, when they're idle, maybe that vehicle spends a lot of time parked near a building when it's in use. So you need to think about the mobility of the vehicles. If you start extending that into equipment, whether that's a start cart on a flight line or a backhoe at a construction site that you're trying to electrify, sort of a similar idea applies. You can charge it where it's idle overnight, but you may want to have access to charging at the location where it's stored, or maybe at a work site, some form of charging there. So there's a mix of those. You can combine use of slow charging with fast charging to meet the needs of equipment. It's really difficult to say one way to approach this, because you might have a vehicle that is on the road frequently, does not spend a lot of idle time. That vehicle may be better served with a fast charger. When you think about liquid fueling, it's much more like the model of using a fast charger. And that is one of the questions I often get. So somebody will say, "Oh, how fast does your car charge?" And my question back to them is, how fast does your cell phone charge? Do you even know? I plug my cell phone in at night before I go to bed. When I get up in the morning, it's fully charged, and I generally use it all day. So in that case, that overnight charging is meeting the needs of that piece of equipment, of my cell phone. For many drivers of EVs, that's the case. That overnight charging at low power is sufficient to meet their commuting needs. That could be true for equipment on a military base. You might find that overnight charging meets the needs of a daily work cycle, and therefore you don't even need to know how long it takes to charge. How long does it take to charge? Well, it's how long it takes you to plug it in and unplug it at the end of that charge session. So for me, that's about maybe 30 seconds to get my car plugged in, and maybe 30 seconds to walk around front and unplug it. So it takes me 1 minute to fuel that vehicle, if you think about it that way. And again, if a vehicle's on the move, if it's using energy around the clock, then maybe having access to fast charging, is needed. To give you an order of magnitude, a level 1 charger for a commercial off-the-shelf product, a COTS EV charger for level 1, you can purchase those for around $300 to $400. A level 2 charger that at the 7 to 10 kilowatt level, those are probably more like $600. A DC fast charger that can deliver 50,000 watts is pushing up probably to $30,000. A 350 kilowatt DC fast charger probably would exceed $100,000. And the installation costs will also scale. You may be able to install a level 1 charger based on just the excess capacity at a site. You already have capacity to do that. A level 2 charger, you need to think about that. Is there 10 kilowatts of excess capacity in an electric service? Almost certainly, if you're adding a 350 kilowatt charger to a facility, it's pretty rare that would be able to happen without thinking about upgrading the capacity from the grid side to that facility. So again, that's why, lowest power, longest time, lowest cost. High power might meet the vehicle's needs or the piece of equipment's needs, but it is going to cost you more. So the next thing you think about is having inventories of vehicles and equipment. Bases tend to have a mix. You may have GSA, lease vehicles through GSA. You have equipment that's owned by different entities on the base, squadrons or units on the base that own equipment. There may be equipment owned by the civil engineering part of that base, support groups that do work on the base. So across those, you have pools of vehicles that may be located geographically all over the place. The other thing is they may be shared. So you may have buses that are used by more than one grouping on a base. You need to inventory all that. Like if you're thinking about electrifying one vehicle in this photo, say the truck's at the top, but you're not thinking about the others, but you're going to do that in 2 or 3 years. To me, the disaster is you do what's needed to meet the needs of one segment of your vehicles, but you haven't done the homework to know sort of how does that progress as you try to electrify fully. You may do upgrades to support this, where you could have done maybe a larger upgrade to support a wider set of vehicles. So trying to do this at a holistic level, thinking about a base as a whole, thinking about what you're going to electrify across all the units on a base. That's something that we've been trying to emphasize in our research work we've done with the Department of Defense, is trying to take more of a holistic approach. And that, it's, I guess the tempting thing is you get grant money, you get money that comes to bases that says, okay, go electrify 5 things or put in a few chargers. And so that's happening, and that's great that that's going on. That gives bases and the personnel on a base experience with equipment, gets them connected in with electricians that do the work. There are some great benefits in doing those sort of smaller pilots. But keep in mind that it's a big difference if you put a couple chargers at a location that are, say, AC level 2 chargers, and that's maybe 20 kilowatts of new load. That probably can be done at many locations without any major upgrades to that facility. But if you come back 2 years later and say, well, that's gone really well, we've got our 3 vehicles working, now we're going to put 50 vehicles into this pool, and we need 25 or 30 chargers. If you haven't thought ahead, there may be a much bigger cost impact and time impact related to serving that. And I touched on it, but the thing about the equipment on a base is vehicles may be the easiest things that drive a distance, but not always. So think about this. You have some known fuel use. You may know the time you operate a piece of equipment. You may have some idea about how far it's traveled, either through odometer readings or log books that are kept during maintenance cycles on equipment. You may have records of how much fuel is used. I think that many bases track their liquid fueling on vehicles with some kind of systems with like RFID cards or fobs that are used, or a card. Looking at what records are available on a piece of equipment. It's probably easier on something like a sedan that's used maybe to run errands on a base compared to, say, a backhoe or an aircraft, a piece of aircraft equipment, a lighting cart for a flight line. Trying to understand their energy use compared to a vehicle may be a little more difficult. The other thing to keep in mind is that distance travel is a great measure if the main use of that vehicle is sort of moving around. If you have something like a garbage truck, the use of energy per unit distance probably will vary radically depending on how many times you run the compactor on the back of the garbage truck. We've seen public transit buses where about half the energy use is not for moving the bus, but is for either cooling or heating the interior of the bus. So keep in mind that devices that do something other than just travel distance may also use a lot of energy to make those needs, work. Another example would be a forklift. A forklift sitting idle probably doesn't use a lot of energy, but if you're doing a lot of lifting and moving of heavy objects, that amount of fuel being used will increase. So trying to track that down, figuring out how much liquid fuel you're using. It's not a one-to-one relationship. If you're burning a gallon of fuel to do something and you're going to electric, you can't just say, oh, that's 34 kilowatt hours. Generally, electric objects are more efficient. So I gave you the example of a Nissan Leaf, one of the early EVs. A 30 kilowatt hour battery in a Nissan Leaf would carry that vehicle about 100 miles. A gallon of gas in a typical sedan that size probably would be maybe a third of that, maybe 30 miles. So there are some differences in efficiency. So it's not a one-to-one relationship. So you can't just say, here's liquid fuel energy, now I know how much electric energy I need. But at least it is giving you some hint at where you're going to land. And again, vehicles, distance, and energy are equivalent as long as that vehicle's not doing something else. So there are a number of types of vehicles where you might have to have more information. If you know how long equipment runs, I've seen records kept on equipment where you log, like when it goes in for maintenance, there's an hour meter that's logged. So you may have some sense of how many hours has that piece of equipment operated over a time window. And all those things can be pieced together to try and build a profile of how much energy does that device need. So energy is part of the equation, but as we talked about, power, energy, and time are all related. So once you know how much energy a device is using, you have to start looking at the drive cycle or the usage cycle. How much time is it idle? When is it in operation? Combining those two things, again, by that power, energy, time relationship, if you have more time idle, you can run at lower power when you charge to meet the needs of that vehicle. The other thing that always comes to mind when you talk about, electrifying and going across vehicles is being really careful about, here you're talking about average. I'm looking at maybe the average distance the vehicle traveled in a day. I'm looking at the average time a piece of equipment was in operation. But you need to think about your outlying cases. What about the worst day? How many hours does that vehicle, in use? It may be that overnight charging meets 99% of your needs, but there's that 1% day where you might need access to a fast charger for a piece of equipment in order to meet your operational and mission goals. So, be careful when you use averages. You need to think about your peak usage. An example would be, say a FedEx or DHL or UPS location, and they're going to electrify their delivery vans, but they don't think about Christmas. They look at the average of the whole year and they size their charging equipment, and then they find out in December they can't meet the needs of those vehicles because they don't have enough peak capacity to operate the deliveries. So it's a really important thing to consider, not just your average day, but your sort of abnormal day where you're having a high pace of operation. All those things pieced together start building an understanding of how much power and how much energy does a piece of equipment need. When you look at those in aggregate, now you can start doing that balance between the equipment energy use and power and the grid availability of energy and power. So again, you have to think about equipment. Where does it live on a facility? I just snagged a picture of a military base here from Google and just said, okay, imagine these vehicles are located at different places around the base. They may reside at these locations in a stored fashion, but they may be shared. So a vehicle may be checked out from one of these locations and it might dwell somewhere else part of the time. So having some understanding of where those vehicles are physically on a base matters, because you have to think about this. If you want to charge at the lowest power, charging has to be available while the vehicle is idle. So having charging available where the vehicle is idle is critical. The other approach is have fast charging so that the vehicle, again, more like liquid fueling, you go to that central location, you charge the vehicle and then go back into operation. Either of those might meet your needs, but more than likely the lowest cost of operation would be using the slower charging, not basing everything on fast charging. So I would challenge you, if you're thinking about operational cycles, try not to get caught too much up in how we use liquid fueled vehicles. Really think about the advantages of a vehicle that can be fueled while it's idle. And you think about the fact that, a crew that uses a vehicle no longer has to take it back to that central fuel location, every few days to top it off, or maybe every shift where they're required to keep the tank full. Now they just plug it in at night and the next morning it's ready for operation. So there may be some real advantages in terms of, mission cycles if you can kind of think about that ahead of time. And again, it comes back to making sure that those vehicles can meet your needs on a single charge or meet the mission for the time they're available. Then overlaid on top of that, a base has an electric grid. There may be limitations on where the wires are running that base from the utility perspective. There may be parts of the base that have excess capacity. There may be parts of the base that are very energy starved in terms of, you can't add any new equipment that consumes electricity at a location. So this gets into modeling both the grid on the base, understanding where that energy is delivered and how it's distributed. This is challenging, particularly that many of our bases have been repurposed over the years, so they may have excess capacity in places where it's like, wow, that doesn't really help me because it's 3 miles on the other side of the base and my operations are here. So there may be challenges about where that energy capacity is available on the base, where power capacity from the grid, and with missions that change. But it's part of looking at energy use, but then also geographic locations where that energy will be consumed and tying those two pieces together. And by doing so, now you start to get a sense of how much can you accommodate. And then the approaches of thinking about, do I approach this from, I look at what's existing on the base, I look for excess capacity, and that's where I'm going to locate charging. And that might be a low cost approach. I know I've got excess capacity at this location. I'm going to move my motor pool there because that's where I can put in charging at the lowest cost. The other approach is to say, this is where the missions are. This is where the vehicles reside. I'm going to do what it takes as far as the distribution and infrastructure side to meet those needs at those locations. And that can be challenging on a cost basis. I've visited bases where all of the utilities are underground. It can be quite costly to relocate utilities if they're underground, and there may be operational reasons why that was done. The existing structures, a lot of times, maybe a building was used for one purpose and that purpose no longer exists, so they may have excess capacity at that building, but maybe where you want to put the charging, that thing is fully subscribed. So it's a real dance here between figuring out locations. You might be able to move vehicles a few hundred yards and get by much lower cost in terms of infrastructure if you're willing to do so. So just having some flexibility and thinking about how the grid and vehicle operation overlays together. The other thing that comes to mind when you think about a military base is there's some real complexities in timelines. Right now, if you look at the equipment used on a base, not everything is available in electric form, or maybe it's available, but it's too costly at this point for maybe more than a trial. A piece of equipment may cost so much more in an electrified form, it's just not feasible. You'll have to think about it. If there's no equivalent today, when is that available? So maybe you think in 3 years, you can, the backhoe that's out there now burning diesel could be fully electric in 3 years. Maybe it's 5 years. So that timeline is out there. Understanding if that piece of equipment is a one-to-one option, so one of the things you can think about is maybe you have, say a pickup truck that's used in a way where it would be challenging for a single electric truck to meet that need. But maybe if you had 2 trucks to replace a single truck, you could do a round robin of one truck charging while the other's in use. So where you don't have a one-to-one replacement option. That's challenging from a cost perspective, but also, there may be vehicle allocations already decided about how units are supposed to operate. And so maybe that defies that. That's something to keep in mind. And then mission readiness, knowing that these vehicles can meet the needs. We've been looking at flight lines, and one of the things that came to mind there is that when a piece of equipment is checked out and taken to the flight line, it needs to meet its mission for the whole time it's on the flight line. The idea of having to take that equipment back and, like having a round and round robin of, running to get another piece of equipment because the batteries have gone dead. That didn't look very, very good in terms of supporting mission readiness. So thinking about the capabilities of the vehicles and can they meet your mission? And again, is it a one-to-one replacement? Is it 2-to-1? You may even find applications where you need less electric equipment because of some of the logistics about not having to go fuel it. The other major thing that comes to mind in the timeline is funding availability. And there's sort of 3 key pieces there. One is you have the infrastructure that we talked about in the previous slide. So if we're thinking about, the wires and poles and transformers on a base, where is the budget to upgrade that? Generally, those monies have a different flavor than if you're talking about equipment. So there's also the challenges of the budget differences and how monies flow. So you have infrastructure upgrades to cover. You'll need to buy the charging hardware to support the vehicles or equipment. Those have a timeline, both in terms of, the installation time, but more importantly here in this bullet, though, is just talking about, do you have the funds to make that happen? And then vehicles and equipment, the timeline for your funding. So, equipment may be readily available, but you don't have budget right now to buy it. So sort of the complexity of piecing all these different timelines together into more of a holistic approach to, electrifying a base is pretty challenging. The last one is, prioritizing equipment electrification. Are you looking for bang for buck? Are you, which part of your fleet consumes a lot of liquid fuel that if you electrified it would be a great advantage? Or which piece of equipment is very noisy and that electrifying it would improve the life of a soldier, sailor, or Marine or airman in operation? So thinking about, maybe it's not just, economics or mission capability, but there may be some advantages in electrifying from the perspective of the personnel operating the equipment. So you'll have to think about what you prioritize. Is it that, is it the impact to the operator's quality of life, or is it all about the dollars or fuel saved, or how much energy you can transition over to electricity? Those things need to be in the back of your mind as you're trying to piece together a priority list. And the other is maybe looking again, like I mentioned, low cost infrastructure. Maybe you're going to electrify part of a fleet because that's the place I have excess capacity. I can go in and update that without a major cost. So thinking through the priorities that you want to place on the table. Obviously, some of these are going to come down by edict from the federal government. Thou shalt do this and give you a date. Others may be to your advantage to think about, from the operational aspects of a base, of the mission of that base, in terms of what you want to prioritize, whether it's quality of life for the operators or monetary considerations. And thinking about all those pieces together, this becomes fairly complex. You're thinking about upgrading infrastructure. Infrastructure upgrades can have very long timelines. If it's a major upgrade, we're hearing numbers now, say for buying a fairly large transformer, can be 50 to 70 week delivery times on a transformer. As I understand, DoD has processes on how you allocate funds and how those are distributed, and those aren't generally fast processes. So, all of these things need to be aligned in time. You can go grab the vehicles off the shelf potentially. Right now, they're sort of in short supply because of supply chain issues that have been going on. But at some point when you can go grab lots of vehicles quickly, the infrastructure may not be able to follow quickly. So just, having this timeline laid out of, matching charging hardware infrastructure and vehicle arrivals where they can meet your mission in a timely way, and then they meet your priorities. That seems like really the biggest complexity I see in all this, is just sort of managing all these pieces in a sensible way. I'm going to stop there. Happy to take questions. I think, my takeaways again from the work we've been doing with bases, it really comes down to this slide. I think the timeline considerations are going to be really challenging, particularly if you get mandates that say you're going to electrify something, where it's not taking into account maybe the timeline of the equipment availability or your infrastructure timeline to upgrade your infrastructure. There may be some real challenges that you may not be expecting. Just because you can buy the vehicle doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to set up to charge it. Or you might find yourself in a situation where you're having a really hard time procuring vehicles that meet a particular need. So Matt, let's go ahead and maybe open up for questions here. And I haven't been watching, but I'll defer to you on the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks so much, John, for your presentation. I think there's a lot of really thought-provoking stuff that you laid out there. We have a couple questions in the Q&A right now. I really please encourage folks to put questions in there. I mean, I have some queued up too, but I think it'll be a more effective Q&A session here if we get the thoughts of folks who are out there hearing your presentation. So please
I can dive in and grab this first one here. Yeah. You want to take them down in order?
Yeah. I'll kind of tee it up here. So the first question, David Clark, thanks for your question, is really about the executive order is driving electrification of vehicles and facilities, right? The idea of electrification of the federal building campus fleet, I guess. Is there enough electricity and infrastructure to meet the demand? But I think maybe the question evolves into something along the lines of, how do you prioritize that? Given the timelines of the executive order, what's more important for the time being? Are there ways to integrate the idea of a grid connected, energy efficient building that kind of leverages that idea of electrification into bringing electric vehicles into the operation of that building? How do you kind of respond to that concept?
It's critical. I think, if you are electrifying vehicles in isolation from thinking about something else that's being electrified on the base, maybe you're converting from natural gas to electric heat in housing on the base. That could manage to be a disaster, right? You've used up capacity to do one thing and neglected another. So it sort of falls in with what the slide I have up now. It's like it needs to be mapped into this timeline, part of the infrastructure upgrades. The other one to think about is, there's a lot of flexibility in general in these. So you might find that an electric vehicle or a piece of equipment is charged in a few hours at the power level that you can provide. So maybe it's in operation 8 hours a day and it's idle, 12 hours or some mix. So say it's idle 12 hours, I can charge it in 4. I now have a lot of flexibility when I charge that vehicle. So having some intelligence in how you manage the use of energy can be used. All those things are challenges because they generally rely on communications. And I know on DoD bases, communications is a real, a tough one, because you have to worry about all the cybersecurity aspects that brings to the table. So it'll be a challenge. I think if you're looking to upgrade facilities, You need to be thinking about that in conjunction with what you think you're going to do with electric fleets, or you might find yourself completing a great facility upgrade and then suddenly needing to do it again. My example is when they come and pave the street down by my house here, and then 3 weeks later, the water department comes by and digs a big trench across because they didn't coordinate. You really want to avoid that. It seems inevitable. Bases are so complex, you're going to have a struggle with it. But I think having somebody looking at that holistic level, knowing what is happening on a base in terms of electrifying, will be really critical.
In your research and experience, are those kind of the transformer, in last month's conversation, we talked a lot about kind of the capacity on a base, and the transformers kind of being that limiting factor. In your experience, is that something that as we look at the timeline of the executive order with a 2027 deadline coming up really quickly, I think, especially if you're a Fed who's managing facilities, do you see that concept of transformer upgrades to manage this increased electrification capacity being something that has to be a factor in most of these kind of campus-wide upgrades?
It's really hard to say, again, because bases change missions. Sometimes that you might find you have excess capacity, equipment that's been abandoned in the past that leaves you flexibility, but you may have bases that are fully subscribed with their electric system now, and there you're looking at everything is an upgrade. Like anything we do beyond what we're doing today requires upgrades. I mentioned lead times on transformers can be more than a year. So if you have a deadline that's 5 years out, you have a real challenge, because you're needing to be really thinking about those upgrades, within the next year or two. You need to be actively working on the upgrades to support it. So I think getting the sort of geographic understanding of where you're going to be consuming power on a base is really important in order to meet a strict timeline.
Yeah, and I'd say also, I think a major important piece of this as we think about the capacity is continuing efficiency programs, right? The more you can reduce and eliminate, and of course this is included in the goals of the executive order as well, of reducing the energy requirement of buildings, will necessarily free up capacity for the electrification, including EV charging as well. So I think there's a real balance, and I think a holistic approach on especially on a campus, as you say, kind of communicating even within the electric vehicle upgrade piece. I think it's a broader conversation of how can you free up capacity to support that and other electrification efforts without having to unnecessarily upgrade other equipment as well. Moving on to Manuel Zapata has a question here. Has the military bought or converted any vehicles already? And I think the question really is from a fleet perspective, right? There are definitely examples of level 1 chargers here, or maybe even level 2 chargers here, a couple outside the public works office or whatever. But have you seen much kind of large scale or the conversation about a fleet conversion at military bases?
So first, a disclaimer: I'm not as well informed about what's going on across all of DoD. We're pretty focused on the areas we work on in the EV space. Having said that, I know there are people working on, like, charging has been put on bases for both access of like personnel that bring vehicles on base and also fleets. Wholesale electrification, where like entire fleets have been done, that's probably not the case at this point. I think most people are more at the trial level, or they've gotten funding to do a few chargers on a base and put those in, but probably not the wholesale electrification. Certainly, I know the Air Force Research Lab has worked on different types of like flight line equipment that they have worked to electrify and test in the field. So I think you're still at the level of, trying some of the equipment out. There are some civilian equivalents. So obviously something like a forklift, those are being electrified in the civilian world. And if you go on a base, you'll probably find a mix of diesel and electric or gasoline forklifts. So people have probably already converted some things over just because from a cost perspective, they were an advantage. But, wholesale electrification, I'll defer to say I'm not aware of any, but, it's possible. But most of what I've seen has been more like the piloting.
Right. Yeah, I think that's my experience as well. And you know, if anybody has any other examples, please post it. Um, Roland de Guzman has a question about centralized DoD sources of funding for upgrading the infrastructure. I think this is um, definitely a major challenge of this effort across the federal government, right? I mean, I think in general, it's a mandate. It's coming as a goal and as an executive order goal that doesn't always carry the funding, appropriated funding applied to that. What kind of thinking have you done around, you know, within the federal government of identifying sources of funding to bring the infrastructure where it needs to be?
So we don't get as involved in that on the EPRI side because we're more of a technology research organization. My observations and what I've seen is that those funding paths are very complex. They are different for each of the services. Which offices in the services are made responsible for the equipment or upgrades, those sorts of things. So how that money flows. It looked to me like it's extremely complicated in terms of like a single source. I've not seen that in the circles I've been in. It seems that like the money comes from many different paths, and mandates sometimes precede the funding. So I think that's another challenge.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think with the importance of this initiative with the presidential administration and the support, and I think initiative the momentum that they're building around this to really make it an important issue. I think there will be some funding to follow this. Is it ever going to be enough to support the, you know, conversion of the charging infrastructure for the entire federal government? No, of course not. But I think that there's other, you know, there's third party financing through ESPCs and UESCs. I think can play a major role here, especially as you think about how you could potentially save money by shifting over to electric fueling. But I think that I think for, you know, for Roland, this is not an answered question by any means. I think it's going to be, you know, a bit of scrabbling, but I think creative energy managers on base will be able to find ways, whether it's a combination of, you know, third party financing and discretionary funding, or, you know, affect grants or other things that can contribute to making that a reality. Carl has a question about the difference between maintenance on electric vehicles as compared to internal combustion engines. You know, does that help make up for the replacement cost of the vehicle difference? And is it, you know, should that be a driver towards maintenance, or maybe is that another source of funding? You know, reduced maintenance on an electric vehicle as compared to what you have to do with ICE vehicles.
So I'm an electrical engineer by background, and I can tell you that an electric vehicle is much simpler than an internal combustion vehicle, just by the number of parts on it, right? So if you think about just from the engineering perspective, it's simpler. So the gut feeling is, yeah, over time, an EV will have a much lower maintenance cost. What we've seen in the market right now is there've been a lot of recalls on some of the like passenger vehicles. So there's still some learning curve for these companies as they produce products, and the cost of those recalls, like when they're having to go back to the dealer and flash new firmware, you know, so they're not like, it's not like, you know, 100%, it's a sure thing right now. But I mean, just from the perspective of the engineering, they are simpler. I can tell you, I'm a Nissan Leaf owner. We've had it for 4 years, and tires, window washer fluid, and wiper blades. Those are the things that I've done maintenance on. There's nothing else to do maintenance on. I think there's a cabin air filter you can change, but there's no oil system. There's not an exhaust system. There's no spark plugs. There's no plug wires. There's no ignition system. You can just think about all these different components. The best data I can refer you to, I know New York had tracked the electrification of their vehicle fleet, and they were finding that the electric vehicles were generally much less expensive maintenance-wise year over year than their gas vehicles. The other area to watch is the companies like FedEx, UPS, DHL. We're seeing them electrify their fleets, and a big part of that I think they're counting on is that those vehicles will be more reliable. I guess the other consideration, batteries do wear out, so there is a life limit on that battery, and that replacement cost compared to maybe the life of the vehicle maybe the vehicle's worn out when the battery's worn out, and it's not a big deal, but that's something that has to come into that calculus of figuring that out. I don't think we have all the answers. I know total cost of ownership right now, generally the fuel savings cost for a consumer with an electric vehicle will make up for the added cost of the electric vehicle. And those are getting better and better. We used to have $100,000 EVs. Now you're seeing a lot of EVs pushing into the $30,000 level. So the battery costs are coming down, the manufacturing quantities are ramping up. But I think, I put my engineering hat on that they will be more reliable just because they are physically simpler.
Right. Robert asks, what's the nexus between EV fleets and renewable energy initiatives in the DoD? And I think you said you weren't necessarily a DoD expert, so maybe this isn't aligned with how you could, kind of question.
I can tell you that our project that I'm involved in, it's certainly been a consideration, thinking about other means. If you can't upgrade infrastructure, could you say put storage there to delay having to upgrade infrastructure, or just meet the need with storage? All of those things, storage costs money, infrastructure upgrades cost money. So there's always coming back to really having to look at a specific situation and calculate that. But I think there is definitely a connectivity between moving toward electrifying things and having other resources, whether that's solar or local storage, that will be integrated together. Again, the complexity, the smarter you make it, the more communications there are, and the more cybersecurity concerns you're going to have. So all those challenges, roll in with that.
Yeah, certainly an integrated approach required. And I think, Robert, the idea of the executive order, if you haven't read it yet, it really is kind of covering all these bases, right? It's not just looking at EVs in a bubble and looking at renewable energy here and efficiency here. The idea is that you have an integrated approach to how you're improving the infrastructure on an installation or on a federal campus. So I think they're all tied together. They can all contribute to an eventual solution. Nothing's easy. It is a complex series of equations to solve. But I think the idea of renewable energy initiatives or other distributed generation, locally generated sources of energy for military bases can help contribute to resilience improvements and sustainability improvements and improvements in reducing greenhouse gas and carbon reduction. So it's all tied together. I think there's not a simple answer to that question, but it's all related.
The other challenge is bases change missions. So squadrons move. Army units change bases. They get new weapons. They get new missions, and so that will always be a challenge. You're building, fixed infrastructure. How flexible can you make that? I think that's something as well that has to be kept in mind. There's probably not a military base in DoD that has not changed some of its mission at some point in time.
That's right.
In its history.
That's right. Ali praises you on an excellent presentation and asks about embedded dynamic wireless power transfer systems as an alternative solution.
It's certainly being researched. So the Department of Energy has done a lot of work in this area. There are a number of private companies looking at that. So if you're not familiar, what he's referring to would be you embed coils under the pavement on a roadway. You use high frequency AC. So in a sense, it's like a transformer, but you've sort of separated the primary and secondary of the transformer. So the vehicle has the secondary of the transformer. And as it drives over coils in the pavement, you transfer energy to that vehicle. Thinking about the base setting, for consumer vehicles, I think the idea was maybe you have a lane on a highway that if your car needed charged, you would, switch over into that charging lane and drive along that lane for some distance. It's extremely expensive because you're digging up pavement to put these coils under the pavement. It also means you've sort of given up, like I can charge my vehicle when it's idle at night if I have a cord. If I charge it wirelessly while I'm driving, then I have to do that while I'm driving. So it has to be tied with the drive cycle of that vehicle. At a military base where a lot of the vehicles, I think, spend a lot of time idle, like they move people somewhere and then they sit for a while, having that, charge in motion may or may not meet the mission well. It's certainly being researched. I think it's a ways off. We're still just getting people getting sort of on their feet about getting consumers to drive plug-in cars. But there is research and it's certainly out there and something to watch for.
I think it tees up a really interesting question about future proofing, right? Like how do you avoid having
Mm.
a short term like massive infrastructure investment in charging infrastructure when maybe 5 years from now it's some sort of dynamic charging system is the standard for electric vehicles. So I think that's something something to take into consideration as you think about this massive infrastructure investment required, and how can you build a future-proof solution so that you can adapt to that as technology changes.
It's always a risk. I think the best mitigation is to use standards as much as you can. Use standardized equipment, standardized connectors, standardized interfaces. Using standards-based charging equipment is really important. Even doing that, looking 5 or 10 years out, it's a dynamic industry. We're seeing a lot of advances. It's really hard to predict what might change. I think what we've seen certainly in the last 10 years is people thought at one point, 50 kilowatt charging was adequate. And now we're seeing 350 kilowatt charging is needed to really meet the consumer desire for how they operate their vehicle. So it's hard to say. I think there's always a little bit of that risk when you do something new. But again, if you follow standards, try not to have custom equipment, having standards-based equipment, that's probably the best thing you can do at this point.
Right. Todd asks, what's been your experience so far balancing cybersecurity and access control and charge management? I think this is a pretty DoD centric question as well, associated with ensuring that anything that you do and everything is internet connected, right? Everything is part of this
Right.
Internet of Things. How do you make sure that what you're doing with a new technology or new infrastructure investment is going to meet the cybersecurity? You're not putting yourself in a vulnerable position.
So certainly on the civilian side of the house, a lot of the charging systems are based on network operations. So using public internet, cell phone modems, transferring data, between charge stations and a central office. I think DoD has a lot of flexibility on a base. You have controls of where people can and can't go. You could have gated parking lots or signage so that, like only the right vehicles are using the equipment. So there are a lot of approaches, like mentioned in that, like locks and keys, or free access. Approaches that don't necessarily have to tie to networking things to meet your needs. If you have a parking garage that has a gate where somebody has to swipe their ID to get into that parking garage, you may not need any other access control beyond that.
Right.
So thinking about those types of approaches, wherever you're tying in a network, you are working with companies that are civilian companies, and whether they have ratcheted up their security to the level that DoD is going to require is really an open question. I think some companies probably would approach that. Others, might struggle a bit. You can look, there's lots of new charging companies. It's kind of a lot of, investor, sort of venture capital funded companies doing charging networks. Whether they'll meet the scrutiny of DoD cybersecurity, that's to be determined, and certainly something you need to look at if you're going to rely on networking. But it's a great question, and one that I highly recommend. Think of things outside that. I've seen charge stations where you put in an access code, so literally keying in a number that releases that station. There are other approaches besides, communications based.
Right. EJ asked about additional things you should consider if you're installing charging infrastructure at a base that has a microgrid to improve resiliency, especially in times of how do you if you're thinking about the vehicles that you need to conduct your mission and you have a utility outage, electricity outage, how do you deal with that within the context of you've gone through the process of getting a microgrid to improve resiliency on your base?
So that's another sort of complexity that is really mission based. So it depends a lot on, like, if it's a unit on the base using vehicles, is their mission something that can be delayed if power's out, or is it mission critical, something that has to happen 24/7? I didn't talk a lot about that, but sort of the backstory is, what are you doing for your liquid fueled vehicles or equipment? Do you have generators backing up the fueling station, or is it that you rely on the fuel that's already in the tanks out there to meet your needs? Answering those sorts of questions may help you build a thought process on how you would do that with electricity. But we have to have something equivalent. You either need, maybe diesel generators that back up charging stations. You need to think about those things. Do you have to tolerate 1 hour, or do you have to tolerate 5 days without a grid available? Those are very different requirements. So having thought through the mission, the complexity is on a base. You probably have some groups that if power's out 5 days, they could stand down for those days, no problem. And another group that they can't be down for an hour. Like they're part of the military mission on that base, and they're not going to stand down for the hour the grid's down. I think it kind of comes back to this prioritizing equipment. You're going to have to also prioritize resiliency. I don't think you can afford to wholesale do everything. You need to think about the layering. I think most bases now have, gen sets that are placed where they're needed, not necessarily one generation system that runs the whole base. Microgrids, may give you some advantage because they do add that, like localized resilience. So you could build off of that, like having microgrids in areas. But it's something that has to be considered.
Yeah. It's all. I love the interaction of the community of interest here, and the really kind of complex questions they drop. There are no easy solutions. This is a very complex, wicked problem that DoD and the federal agencies are going to have to solve to make progress. It's the top of the hour right now. I really want to thank John for your thoughtful presentation and insightful responses to the Q&A. Carl, I know that you've said in the past when we have there's more than 20 questions still queued up in the Q&A. I would love if we could get a written record of those to John to help kind of answer some of those for the community of interest in writing. When we publish the recording or whatever. So thank you again to John. Thank you again for a very engaged community of interest here on an interesting topic. And hopefully we can continue the engagement on the next one. Thanks again.
Thank you.